Twitch. So we can see that, you know, extremism in many ways, unfortunately, is become a business online. It's generating content, it's generating views, etc. So assailants, they're often radicalized in these online environments to begin with. This is how they get instructions on how to attack, such as the Fort Hood massacre. But they also use the social media networks to amplify their reach while committing the crimes. Often with the white supremacists, they hope that their attack, by broadcasting their attacks, it's a call to action in hopes that other white supremacists will join and eventually start this inevitable race war, is something that they believe. So this is the reality. This is kind of what we're dealing with. Next slide, please. So the digitization of anti-Semitism. When we think about all the sources of anti-Semitism today, so from Christian anti-Judaism, conspiracy theories, Holocaust denial, anti-Semitism on the political far right, on the political far left, from Islamist extremists, there is one place where all of these sources exist at the same time, and that is online. And so this is something called the digitization of anti-Semitism. It's connected with something called the disinhibition effect. This is where people are far more hateful when communicating electronically than when they are face-to-face. So what are we seeing? How is anti-Semitism manifesting online? So I want to quickly run through 7 online manifestations. The list you're seeing is not a comprehensive list, but it's a pertinent start. So what are we going to discuss? We're going to discuss memes, coded speech, trolling, the echo, doxing, impersonation, and disinformation. So we'll start with memes. Next slide, please. So memes are a humorous image. They're a video, they're a text that is copied. We circulate memes all the time. However, anti-Semites also use memes. And the one that you see here is a meme called the happy merchant or the smirking merchant. It's one of the most popular memes that we're seeing. Most of the tropes that it's used is pulled from the forgery, the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which focuses on Jewish control, power, etc. And most of the users of this meme are on the far right. We do have data now that shows that since 2016, white supremacist accounts across all platforms has increased 600% just in the last 4 years. Next slide, please. The next one is something called coded speech or play on words. So extremists toy with new ways of targeting Jews implicitly, right? So instead of using the word Jewish, they'll use the word globalist or the media or East Coast bankers, something that's, you know, maybe not as well known by flaggers or by people taking down content. It's more subtle. It's this winking, this nudging, you know, dog whistling, if you will. Next photo, please. Here's another example. We have the media, you have Hollywood, you have government. But if you kind of look at this image and what they're trying to say, well, both of these, you know, the tweet and also this image, they're both online. They weren't considered something of content to be taken down. So why is coded speech so popular? So first, it creates intimacy between the speakers and the readers or the audience. And then the author can also deny that they are, like, what they feel if an unpleasant situation arises. So they can say, oh, I'm not an anti-Semite, I was just trolling, or I was practicing free speech, etc. Next slide, please. So trolling, can you go back one, please? Thanks. Trolling is defined as creating discord on the internet by starting quarrels or upsetting people, posting inflammatory remarks, etc. And one example right here is of Milo Yiannopoulos. He's the British far-right political commentator. He left, used to work at Breitbart. Well, he was accused a few years ago of anti-Semitism. And he denied it, vehemently denied it, said that he was just trolling, he was just making fun, he's not an anti-Semite. And then his Twitter passwords were leaked. Next picture. The first password that was leaked was Kristallnacht. So this is the night of broken glass, the biggest pogrom in Germany and Austria before the start of the Holocaust. That was one of his passwords. The next password of his was Long Knives 1290. Now this might not be as familiar, but Long Knives actually refers to the 1934 Nazi purge, which solidified Hitler's power. And then 1290, that's the date that Jews were expelled from medieval England. And so you can see the mask fall, right, with this revelation. Next, please. So the echo is an online use of multiple parentheses around Jewish individuals. It was actually originally used by anti-Semites, by white supremacists, to target Jewish professionals in journalism, politicians, businessmen, etc. And also referring to Jewish, it would be quote unquote like entities, whether it be the Holocaust or narratives or media. They would put these ellipses around those words as well. Next picture, you can see that here, talking about narratives. It's this idea that maybe they're fake. Now we saw an incredible civil society response actually to this this echo being used, and it was by non-Jews starting to use the echo, the parentheses around their names. And what happened was we saw the internet being flooded with people using this parentheses. And all of a sudden, the anti-Semites didn't know who was Jewish and who was not. And this is an example right here. This last picture is a screen grab of Katharina von Schnurbeind's Twitter account. She is the European Commission coordinator on combating anti-Semitism, not Jewish. But she has put the ellipses on her name in solidarity with the Jewish community. Next slide. So then we have doxing. Doxing refers to putting personal identification online. So your phone number, an address, the names of your children, where your children go to school. And so what neo-Nazis would do is they post this information online, they'd make it available, but they wouldn't tell you what to do with it. But it's like the audience knows, right? It's that dog whistling again. And so the case with Whitefish, Whitefish, Montana is where Richard Spencer, the white nationalist, his mother lives. He also lives there part-time. There was an incident with a Jewish realty agent. And so what this neo-Nazi website, Daily Stormer, did is they posted pictures and identifying information of Whitefish's Jewish community online and called their followers to storm Whitefish, Montana, to go basically and do something with this information. So that's called doxing. Next, please. Two more to go. We have impersonation. So there was a call like about a year ago, I think, that came out on 4chan, which is an anonymous English language image board website. It's heavily used by white supremacists because of the anonymity. And there was a suggestion to masquerade as Jews, set up fake accounts and pretend to be Jewish individuals. And so next pictures, please. So we saw fake Twitter accounts being set up. They were masquerading as Orthodox Jews, as leftist Jews, as Israelis, and they were actually spouting anti-Semitic material. So you have, it's like modern day protocols of the Elders of Zion on the internet. So you have someone who looks Jewish, who says they're Jewish, and saying, I want to control the world. I run a secret banking cabal. They're purposely putting out these tropes, completely inappropriate. Next slide, please. So in the battles, right, of the future, we're seeing that this line between what is truth and what is real being blurred with what is fake. And this is going to be really the next 10 to 15 years of how we're to counter that blurring. So this last one I want to mention is disinformation. Most, if not all, the tech companies' business models rely on engagement, right? Increased engagement. And we know it is lies, it is fear, and it is anger. Like those three things, like that's what generates the most engagement. Lies spread 6 times faster than truth. Fun fact, maybe not a fun fact, but lies spread 6 times faster than truth. And so Facebook and other social media platforms actually enable the proliferation of misinformation. So we know Facebook, for instance, will run any political ad as long as they are paid, even if it's a lie. So Facebook will even micro-target certain users to maximize that ad's effectiveness. Our personal data is actually sent out. It comes back as targeted messaging in order to change our behavior. And this picture here, I mean, we saw this play out in the 2016, now we know this, in the 2016 US presidential race, Brexit, and the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where our data was really used to change the course of history, if you will. We also know that YouTube has exacerbated the threat of terrorism for several years, not anymore, but for several years it did, because when a user would go onto YouTube and watch a terrorist propaganda video, YouTube's algorithm actually created a playlist of related videos for its viewers. Watch something, oh, because you like this, you might also like all of these things here. And what that did was it was actually encouraging users to go further into that terrorist radicalization hole. We also know that Twitter, for instance, roughly 15% of Twitter accounts are fake. They're bots, and which is really complicated because bots create this idea of popular consensus. So bots are going to repeat words. They're going to repeat anti-Semitic phrases, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, but they're fake accounts. However, real human users don't know that. And they actually start thinking that, oh, more and more people think this way. It's okay to say these things. And you actually are seeing some of these words that were used on fake accounts being used by real human users. And that's a correlation that we also need to work to fight. So again, this is a lot of material, and this is what we have to deal with to push back. So now I want to talk about best practices. Next slide, please. So I want to focus on a couple of things. You can stop. Yeah, perfect there. So it's really the role of individuals, of civil society, of government, and tech companies working together to really push back against online anti-Semitism. And I want to list some tools here. I think that's one of the reasons why we're gathered here, is that giving us the tools to use in this fight. So the first is education. We first need to know what online anti-Semitism is and what it's not. Next picture, please. So AJC's created an important resource on this topic called Translate Hate. It's essentially a glossary of anti-Semitic terms, memes, cartoons, conspiracies, etc. And we're going to be sending a digital copy of this to everyone who's attending this lecture as well. Next. So we also need to know about the First Amendment and what it says, but also what it doesn't say. I think there's a lot of confusion about the First Amendment, especially for even non-Americans, but even for Americans. So the First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. But there are categories that are not protected. So incitement, defamation, fraud, obscenity, child pornography, fighting words, incitement to violence, etc. Like, this is not protected speech. And we also have to remember that freedom of speech is an individual right. There are limitations on free speech for the greater good, such as preserving public order or protecting other democratic values like equality. And then next, please. The third thing is with critical thinking. The internet community can be active in creating and disseminating educational materials and programs that encourage critical thinking. But in addition to critical thinking, I would also argue that civic responsibility needs to be up there, as does empathy, and really those three things together. Next, please. So the second is counter speech. And counter speech is any direct response to hateful or harmful speech which seeks to undermine it. So it's connected to the critical thinking aspect. So, you know, the answer to speech is even more speech. So this includes direct response. It includes setting the record straight, comedy and satire, if appropriate, etc. AJC Paris actually launched a campaign a few months ago called Je suis là, which means in French, I am here. And it was an initiative, civil society initiative, to push back against online abuse. Counter speech obviously only goes so far. There needs to be more tools in the toolbox. Next one, please. So the third is reporting. So as internet users, we can and need to report hateful, inappropriate posts. So all platforms have places to do so. We'll also be sending you information on how to do that for all the major platforms after this lecture. We also know reporting only goes so far. One example is, at its peak, ISIS had 70,000 Twitter accounts in 12 different languages. Even though users were constantly reporting that ISIS was violating Twitter's code of conduct, those accounts still remained up. So we're getting a little stronger now. How do we respond? Next, please. So, and one more, legislation. And this is really where legislation comes in. So not necessarily with the United States, given our First Amendment, but other nations around the world are waking up to the influence that social media giants have been exerting over their domestic politics. And between 2012 and 2017, some 50 countries, 50 countries, actually passed laws that restrict the online speech of their citizens. These aren't authoritarian countries. These are actually some of the most liberal countries in the world. Why? They were fearful of terrorism. They were fearful of extremism and simply fake news. This picture here you see is the European Commission actually put forth legislation telling the tech companies that they had 24 hours to remove illegal hate speech once it was reported. And they had 1 hour. This is something called the golden hour to remove terrorism content. Now, of course, it's trickier in the United States. The US Congress can't legislate, but the tech companies can. And this is the big issue. The tech companies can create and they can follow their own rules. Social media companies should be responsible for what is on their platforms and not confuse First Amendment with corporate responsibility. Next, please. One more, perfect. So censorship. Now, this is really when we start seeing tech companies respond. This is another best practice. Tech companies kind of woke up to the fact that their marketplace of ideas that they wanted, where the best ideas would rise up, didn't really happen. And their platforms were actually being used to, foment extremism, et cetera. And so amidst national outcry against their own realizations of what was happening, they start taking content down. They start expanding their definition of hate speech. And we see Twitter, and this is in the last few years. This is very, very recent. We see Twitter banning most virulent white supremacist accounts. They actually also suspend ISIS accounts, which we know now, Twitter's suspension of those accounts severely affected the Islamic State's ability to develop and maintain robust and influential communities online. So, a big win there. Facebook's removed pages that promote violent white supremacism. Reddit's rewritten its code of conduct. The co-founder of Cloudflare actually kicked off Stormfront, that neo-Nazi website, after Charlottesville. White supremacists are finding themselves banned from OkCupid and Airbnb, et cetera. So this is happening, and it's a massive industry shift. There are, of course, some counterproductive outcomes. I mean, the hate doesn't disappear. It's just going underground, and it can no longer be publicly shamed. For some, it's even a badge of honor to be kicked off a mainstream platform. And like, for instance, ISIS is not using Twitter, but it's using Telegram, like an encrypted service. So they're finding other ways to communicate. And then I'm going to end here on this last sixth and final point on social responsibility. So this is the next one. So we talked about individual responsibility with reporting, with counter speech, with education, but the tech companies, I feel like, also have a responsibility to not just take down content, but to be proactive. And I want to give one example of Google. Next picture, please. So Google a couple years ago did something where if they type in, "How do I join ISIS?" into Google, a carefully curated team of Google extremist specialists created an algorithm to reroute that user to anti-ISIS videos and links, basically. So Google was being proactive and not letting them see those kinds of material. And when we think about those pieces, right, the education, the reporting, those best practices, if you will, there's been some progress. I mean, the question is, are we too late? Can we do more? There's still, of course, a lot more to be done. Because the tech giants are located here in America, we know that the United States will continue to be on the forefront of tackling online hate and dealing with issues of the First Amendment and free speech. So nowhere in America do issues of the First Amendment and freedom of speech play out more than on US college campuses, which is next on our agenda. So I now want to turn the floor over to my colleague, AJC Director of Campus Affairs, Zev Hurwitz. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Holly. Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in. So moving ahead to our discussion about the campus space. Let's see if we can advance this. There we are. The American college campus is a war zone. Jewish students are under attack, and pro-Israel students on campus are made to feel unsafe on a daily basis. Now, these are three statements you will not hear me say over the next 20 minutes or so, because they're simply not true for the vast majority of American Jewish college students. I use this framing to start off this conversation because when we're talking about problematic activity on campus, the good, the bad, and the ugly, we're talking about things that are affecting, even if they're affecting Jewish students in large numbers, this is a small portion of the overall American Jewish college experience. And it's important to use that framing because this is not happening every single day to every single student on every single campus. There tends to be this big community-wide concern that that is actually the case, because these are the things that get reported. And we'll talk about positive things that are happening on campus towards the end, but it's important to understand what the problematic activity looks like so that we know how to push back against it. So we're going to focus a lot of this conversation on the BDS movement, which I'm sure a great number, if not everybody on the call, is familiar with, at least in passing. And the BDS movement is part of this conversation on anti-Semitism because of the core ideology behind it. The BDS movement is not just an anti-Israel movement. It's not just an anti-occupation movement. It's not just a West Bank Judean Samaria movement. It is an anti-Zionist movement. The underlying mission of the BDS movement is the elimination of the state of Israel. Now, I need to be very clear before we jump into this conversation about BDS that not every adherent to BDS, whether it's on campus or in governments, is an anti-Semite. That is simply not true. But the underlying ideology, as we'll explore, is rooted in anti-Semitism. The BDS movement stands for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Boycott speaks more towards purchasing choices, deciding not to buy goods that are produced in Israel or settlements in the West Bank. Sanctions, jumping ahead to S, speaks more towards tax on Israel at the international level, and hopes that countries will utilize sanctions against Israel to delegitimize it and harm it economically and on the world stage. And then the piece that's most relevant to the campus space is divestment, which is calling on institutions to change investment practices so that Israel is harmed through companies not wanting to conduct business with Israel, for Israel's military, or inside of Israel. At its core, we're not talking about a political tactic. We are talking about a movement that was designed to eradicate the state of Israel and directly contest Zionism, directly contest the Jewish right to self-determination in their ancestral homeland. We're not talking about an anti-occupation movement. This is something that comes to the core, or at its core, is anti-Zionist and anti-existence of Israel, which is why it's so problematic. The movement was started in 2005 by Omar Barghouti, the gentleman you're seeing on your screen. We are going to look at a quick quote from him. Good riddance, the two-state solution for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is finally dead. This is a direct quote from Omar Barghouti, the founder of the movement. We're not interested in peace. We're not interested in peaceful resolution to the conflict. We are interested in no more Israel. Mr. Barghouti is making a number of appearances on college campuses around the world, or around the country via Skype, because he's not actually allowed in the United States, but is still a very active part of the campus BDS movement and is perpetuating ideas that at its core are anti-Semitic. There are three main goals of the BDS movement, which come back to this idea of wanting to eradicate the state of Israel. Noting that the BDS movement, of course, is anti-two-state solution. Number one of the goals is ending occupation and the colonization of all Arab lands and dismantling the wall. This directly speaks to the idea of what the Middle East situation is to begin with, that there is a state of Israel on what BDS supporters claim is Arab land. And that speaks to the idea that there is no end game of peace here. We're not talking about a movement that wants there to be a side-by-side two-state solution. Jumping ahead here, a goal of recognizing the fundamental right of the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality. Now, this ignores reality. This ignores that citizens of the state of Israel do have equal rights. We start to deviate a little bit from that when we're talking about residents of the West Bank. But in Israel, there is equal rights legally for Jews and for non-Jews. And so this completely ignores reality and is more of a direct attack on the state of Israel, to misinform the public and lead public opinion against Israel. And then finally, respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. This is also directly counter to the two-state solution. If every single person who is now classified as a Palestinian refugee were to return to putting return in quotes, were to move into what is now the state of Israel, there's a demographic issue that would essentially threaten Israel's existence as a Jewish state and therefore end the state of Israel as we understand it. It's important to note that while the movement was founded in the Palestinian territories, most advocates of BDS are not actually Palestinians themselves. And in fact, there are some great examples of where BDS has actually hurt Palestinians. The example that we talk about a lot is SodaStream, which is a company that had a manufacturing plant in the West Bank, and due to pressures from the BDS movement, had to move their factory to a different part of the region outside of the West Bank, and 500 Palestinians lost their jobs as a result of that. So, I mean, who is the real loser when BDS successfully got SodaStream to move its factory? The way that the BDS movement on campus has manifested over the last decade or so has been through what we talked about earlier in divestment. The way that works on campus is a student group, most usually the Students for Justice in Palestine, but there are different variations on different campuses. It goes by different names depending on where you are, will organize a movement at the student government level or the student body-wide level to pass a advisory resolution calling on the university administration to divest its university holdings and investments from companies that do business in Israel. Now, you're looking at a partial list here of campuses where there has been a successful BDS movement, I'm putting successful in quotes, a successful BDS movement that has passed a resolution, whether it's at the student-wide level or the student government level, calling on the university in an administrative capacity to, or in an advisory capacity to divest funds from Israel. Now, had we all been in the same room, I would ask the audience, how many of these universities have actually changed their investment practices? So I'm going to pretend that somebody is calling out 30 and somebody is calling out 15 and somebody is calling out 100. And the answer, as some of you may have guessed, is 0. This has not been a successful movement on campus. This has certainly succeeded in creating a hostile campus climate for a lot of students, for making it very time consuming for Israel advocates to contest these misleading and rooted in anti-Semitic claims on campus. And a lot of students have had to drop classes or stay up really late into the night preparing for combating these campaigns. But no university president and no university administration in the United States has ever changed their investment practices as a result of an advisory vote from Students for Justice in Palestine or student government. It just has not changed any policies on the ground. So why does this matter, right? Why are we spending all of this time talking about a BDS movement that has yet to actually get a university to change its investment practices? On the one hand, there's the moral concern. The moral concern is that there is an attack on Jewish self-determination on campus, that if Jewish students and pro-Israel students, if they are not actively organizing against it, is basic, I mean, it is almost equivalent to giving it a pass. This is horrifically bigoted rhetoric that's just allowed to exist on campus if it goes unchecked. We also have seen data that shows that 80% of students who are on campus, and I'm talking about Jewish students, non-Jewish students, everybody, the entire campus, 80% of the American college space consists of students who do not know or do not care about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at all. So not contesting the BDS movement and not pushing back against these advisory votes, which again have not been successful in actually achieving policy change, is important because that 80% stands to fall victim to misinformation and support for a movement that's rooted in anti-Semitism. That simply can't happen. AJC and many other organizations are involved with helping empower students to take the really important step of pushing back against BDS, even though BDS hasn't yet to have a tangible impact, certainly not an effect on the state of Israel, but not even an effect on the university administrators who hold the keys to the investment planning. And then also there's the hostile environment too. A movement that exists to disenfranchise and alienate Jewish students is not something that should go unchecked while on campus. Just very briefly, AJC is very involved with combating the BDS movement on campus and in a number of other capacities. There's an entire section of the AJC website dedicated to talking about AJC's work with the BDS movement elsewhere. why is there so much focus on this, right? We've talked about why it's unsuccessful, and we've talked a little bit about why there is a need to push back on this. But the BDS movement has taken up most of our time in a conversation about anti-Semitism because it is a very measurable manifestation of anti-Semitism on campus. You can count the number of campuses that have had something that is a close relative or a direct descendant of a centralized BDS movement. This is a global concern. This is a movement that exists outside the United States. It exists on the world stage. It exists for businesses or religious institutions. So this is not something that's limited to the campus space, but it's very alive and well on the campus space. And it's easily identifiable. Something that comes off as, or something that is billed as a divestment resolution speaks to the D in BDS. It's part of the movement. And that movement, as we've talked about over and over again, is not an okay movement. Anti-Semitism on campus also manifests in a number of other ways, and these are just some headlines that have been grabbed from the last couple of years. Everything from a graduate student union opposing a kosher food campaign to students being told they can't sit on student government boards at, I'm counting 3 just on the screen right now, because of their Jewish or pro-Israel identity. And so anti-Semitism is still manifesting in more traditional ways on campus besides the BDS movement. But a lot of the anti-Semitism directly stems to this expectation that Jewish students are necessarily pro-Israel and that Zionism as an identity is problematic for existing in the campus space. I also want to add that the BDS movement, because it has been largely unsuccessful on campus in terms of actually changing anybody's mind or at the administrative level, the BDS movement is looking for more wins, so to speak. They're looking for ways to actually get something in the win column. And we've seen in the last couple of years a push to see more of the academic boycotts against Israel. There was a whole debacle, folks on the call remember last year at Pitzer College, where a study abroad partnership with the University of Haifa was threatened by a BDS-driven student activist or faculty movement. At New York University, a couple of academic departments have expressed interest in an academic boycott towards the school's Tel Aviv campus, but also towards Israeli scholars in general. There have also been more targeted boycotts on campus. Sabra hummus products is a big target of BDS boycotts on campus because of their affiliation with Israel and support for Israel's military. I also want to talk really quickly in this conversation about progressive spaces and students with Zionist identities. This is another area where anti-Semitism manifests a little bit differently that's not directly tied to the BDS movement, but in a lot of times in the campus world, Jewish students will want to be involved with social justice causes. One of the big ones is campus tuition affordability. It's very hard to find people who pay college tuition who don't wish that college tuition was lower. But everything from reproductive health to immigration to climate justice, there are a number of causes that students want to get involved with, and there has been this growing trend of Jewish students and certainly pro-Israel students being excluded from these spaces because of their Jewish or Zionist identity. Now, this is a form of anti-Semitism that's certainly different and a little bit more direct than the BDS movement, but a lot of times Jewish students are seen as or Zionists are seen as white colonizers. They're prohibited from being part of intersectional communities on campus because of this identity, and that's a real problem that a lot of Jewish students are facing right now. What do you need to know? So we're going to talk in a second about best practices, but really the framing here that I started with is that this is not the experience of every Jewish student all the time on campus, right? At the same time that I wake up to an email until the coronavirus pandemic broke out, I wake up to an email at least twice a week saying that there's some campus somewhere in the US that somebody has graffitied a swastika in a dorm room, or there's been some vandalism that's on the Hillel building or something concerning, right? These are the things that make headlines, but what we don't see making headlines enough is the positive things that are happening on campus. 1,000 students coming to a Shabbat dinner, Jewish students advocating for a kosher food initiative on campus, interfaith partnerships, Jewish students taking on leadership roles in student government or across campus or in athletics. There are so many great positive stories about the Jewish community on campus that are not being reported because they are dwarfed by conversations about the BDS movement, concerns about Jewish students existing in progressive spaces or not existing in progressive spaces, and a story about a swastika is going to make it into my inbox every single time, whereas a campus that puts together a fantastic interfaith program or a giant Shabbat dinner is unfortunately just not as newsworthy. I want to pivot a little bit to best practices for students that are on campus. The first thing that we talk about with our students in the AJC Campus Affairs Department is finding your allies and your community. Combating anti-Semitism, whether formally in the form of a counter BDS movement or directly for a student that is individually targeted for their Jewish identity, it only gets easier when you have a strong community behind you, whether that's your Hillel community, your Jewish community, your roommates, your friends on campus, the communities that have partnered with your community. Building a community proactively is very, very important for putting yourself in a position to succeed. And that jumps straight to the next point, proactive coalition building. This is not bigotry, hatred, and targeting of students is not specific to the Jewish community, unfortunately. Jewish community the Jewish community as an entity on campus should be actively pursuing coalitions with other communities on campus, not because we need to change everybody's mind to be pro-Israel all across campus, but because it just makes sense for the Jewish community to have the community support of other minority groups on campus that are potentially subject to discrimination of their own. And it doesn't have to be an Israel issue, but it does have to be a hate issue. And the one thing we can all get behind is that hate does not belong on campus. Understanding the different levels of campus administration, this is something that I always recommend to students when they're getting to campus, is to understand who the authorities are on campus. What is the chain of command? A lot of campuses are introducing new equity, diversity, and inclusion offices, which can be very helpful resources in terms of navigating problematic activity on campus. So understanding the systems that you go to school in is really important for determining your next steps or for addressing an issue. And then finally, see something, say something. The only reason that we have any of the things that, that have appeared in this slideshow is because a Jewish student leader or a pro-Israel student leader on some campus saw something that was wrong and decided to stand up against it. And we, as a community, cannot be helpful or supportive to students if students aren't telling us where and when there are actual problems. But on the same note, see something, say something, I think also should apply for positive things. Jewish students should be able to turn around and tell us what their successes are, and we should be supporting and applauding the successes and the triumphs of Jewish student communities on campus as well. As always, throughout this conversation, questions at ajc.org. Happy to chat after the presentation, but now I'm going to turn the conversation over to my colleague in the AJC Los Angeles office. There he is, Siamak Kordestani.
Thank you, Zev. And I think I have control of the slides now, but Brian, in case you haven't done that yet, can you go to the next slide? Great. So I'm going to be talking about bipartisanship and the dangers of politicizing anti-Semitism in this segment. This has always been an important issue, but it's been an especially important issue the past year, with a lot that's been going on in Washington, D.C. and in Congress especially. So next slide, please. I'm going to be talking about three areas in this topic. One is the boy who cried wolf syndrome. Another is the hyperpolarization of U.S. politics, and what I like to call the democratization of truth through social media. And the other is dangers facing the bipartisan consensus on anti-Semitism in Israel. And then I will talk about two ways that everyone on this call can help stop the politicization of anti-Semitism in U.S. politics and to work with their legislators, their representatives in Congress, to pass bipartisan solutions to combat anti-Semitism at home and abroad. So next slide, please. So the boy who cried wolf syndrome is something that Ira Foreman, who was the U.S. Special Envoy for combating anti-Semitism under the Obama administration, that actually our first speaker, Holly Huffnagle, used to work for at the State Department. And he said in an op-ed in Newsweek in April of last year, you can only use the issue of anti-Semitism as a cudgel against your political opponents so many times before people begin to discount the validity of any charge of anti-Semitism. Such an outcome is in no one's benefit, save actual bigots and extremists. So if anything and everything can be labeled anti-Semitic, hypothetically, then the boy who cried wolf syndrome kicks in, because then people will stop paying attention. You have no more credibility when you talk about the issue. When it's constantly used to create a wedge between your adversaries, so for example, between people of a political party, politicians of a political party, or between members of that political party and the Jewish community, then we run the risk that actual anti-Semitic rhetoric will be less noticeable and less likely to receive the condemnation it deserves. Now that's a really important point. However, we should be careful about how far we take that, because at the same time, you don't want to have the boy who cried wolf, quote unquote, syndrome be used to stifle legitimate criticism of a politician or a political party. So I think there's a careful balance that needs to be had there, and I think we need to be careful to be able to criticize people in either political party for not supporting a certain policy initiative that's important for combating anti-Semitism, while at the same time not weaponizing anti-Semitism. And I think that that's an important balance to strike. Brian, if you can go on to the next slide. So I also want to talk about this issue in the context of the hyperpolarization of U.S. politics and how social media plays into that. So anti-Semitism is obviously a unique and ancient hatred. It's been around for a long time. It's increasing now, and that's happening because we've seen that ebb and flow through history. However, as a rising phenomenon, it's also interacting with a new problem, a worsening problem, which is hyperpolarization in American politics today. Now, of course, a lot of people say that, we've had times in our history where polarization has been even worse. For example, we've had a civil war in the 19th century. But what's different now is that we're seeing social media play into it. And so when anything and everything is used toward a political end, and the truth itself becomes a victim, statements are valued by whether they help or hurt one side, and everything becomes a zero-sum game. So social media can make this dynamic worse. Zach Beauchamp says on Vox, it's easier to spread misinformation on social media than to correct it, and it's easier to inflame tensions on social media than to mend them. And we see nuance lost on social media as well. And it's not just because of the character limits. It's because, unfortunately, we have less of a attention span when it comes to conversations on the screen, as opposed to conversations had in places where you can have more nuance. And we've seen that played out. The controversy that arose with Ilhan Omar, and for example, Lee Zeldin, who challenged her on social media, that happened on Twitter, and a lot of the back and forth that's happened between Democrats and Republicans and conservatives and liberals have played out on Twitter. So if you can go to the next slide, Brian, I'm going to talk about one more issue, and then I'm going to get into some ways that everyone on this call can work toward combating anti-Semitism in partnership with our legislators. So, because so far on this call, we've heard a lot about what the problem is, and we've heard some solutions, but I want to talk about also some ways that we can really move the needle when it comes to public policy. So just as important it is to maintain bipartisan support for Israel, which is also becoming politicized, unfortunately. It's important to maintain bipartisan support for anti-Semitism, because the more the issue of anti-Semitism is politicized, the less likely it is for government action against anti-Semitism to be steady and unyielding when there's a change of party in the White House or Congress. And unfortunately, the idea that anti-Zionism, specifically that Israel does not have a right to exist or should exist, has gained traction on the far left. And that's really contributed to the politicization of the conversation about Israel. And we certainly don't want that to happen when it comes to anti-Semitism. And those two issues, because of anti-Zionism, there's an interplay there. So next slide, Brian, please. What can you do to promote bipartisan action on anti-Semitism? Well, first of all, we talk about asking your member of Congress to join bills and caucuses and whatnot, and I want to go a little bit beyond that, because a lot of the people on this call who are involved with the Los Angeles Jewish community, for example, live in Congressman Ted Lieu's district or Congressman Sherman's district. These are people who have been involved with these initiatives. But what we want to do is we want to get your friends and relatives and colleagues in Los Angeles beyond, this neighborhood or the city of Los Angeles. We want to go far beyond that. We want to go into the places where we're getting into the suburbs, we're getting into Orange County, we're getting into the broader Southern California region, and even around the country, to get other members of Congress and other senators to join these initiatives. And one of the most important ones is something that AJC was involved in launching, the Bipartisan Task Force for Combating Anti-Semitism. And that was launched a few years ago with the help of AJC, with the help of our CEO, David Harris, and others on the East Coast. But we now have, excitingly, a Bipartisan Anti-Semitism Task Force in the Senate as well, which was launched very recently in 2020. So these task forces in each chamber of Congress, they work to raise awareness of anti-Semitic incidents in the US, around the world. They work with their colleagues in other countries, most notably in Europe, because that's where anti-Semitism has been really bad in the past 2 decades in particular. And for just one of many examples, in May 2018, AJC worked with the task force co-chairs to draft a letter that was signed by 121 members of Congress, urging Secretary Pompeo to appoint a special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism, basically to replace Ira Forman, which took a really long time under the Trump administration. And in part because of the efforts of AJC, Ilan Carr was sworn in as envoy about a year after that letter was sent, with many Republicans and Democrats signing on. And that just goes to show that we don't need everyone. For example, there are people on this call who are dialing in from the East Coast and beyond, and they're not just from Los Angeles. But here at AJC Los Angeles, we don't just need everyone to fill out their action alert on ajc.org/takeaction and contacting their local congressman, because a lot of you, as I mentioned, are constituents of Ted Lieu or Adam Schiff or Brad Sherman and other champions of combating anti-Semitism. We need you to talk to people who live in Orange County. We need you to talk to people who live in San Diego. We need to go to Arizona, to New Mexico, to Nevada, and far beyond, to your friends and colleagues and family members and network on the East Coast, in the Midwest, in the South, in Seattle, and everywhere. Brian, if you go to my last slide, I want to talk about one other major thing we're working on. There's a bill called the No Hate Act, and it is a bipartisan bill introduced by Representatives Donald Bayer and Pete Olson to combat hate. And what does this bill do? It provides incentives for expanding hate crime reporting. And the reason for that is that in a lot of places in the United States, perhaps not in Los Angeles, because Los Angeles does a relatively good job of collecting hate crimes statistics and on police reports and things like that. But in a lot of states in this country, there is really poor hate crime reporting. And we can't solve a problem if we don't understand it. And we can't get law enforcement and policymakers to do more to solve the issue if we can't understand it better. It also creates grants for state-run hate crime hotlines, which would also improve the ability to report, also improve the ability to give vulnerable communities the ability to take action against hate crimes at various levels, local, state, and federal. And then this bill also significantly, this is a very much a judiciary, a legal element to it. It adds penalties for individuals convicted under prior hate crimes acts. And you know, that sometimes has a lot of people nervous because, you know, sometimes the penalty for hate crimes is the death penalty if it's a domestic terrorist attack, like for example in Pittsburgh or Poway, and that's a separate conversation to be had. But there are things such as more minor offenses of hate crimes act, which end up putting criminals in prison. And these are people who maybe did things that were not necessarily violent, but had to do with tagging property or putting up graffiti, and they've served time, and the additional penalties come in the form not of many extra years of prison, but they may come in the form of community service toward the community that they harmed, or educational programs during their parole that teach them about, for example, the Sikh community, the Muslim community, the Jewish community, and how hate crimes hurt people, and to teach them empathy. So, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be heavy-handed, you know, extra 20 years of prison for someone who was not a violent criminal. It could also be positive things that can help these people when they're under parole. So those are two things that everyone on this call could be doing to talk to their friends, their colleagues, their network all around the country. And we can really get the needle moving on this issue through these two things. And submit your questions. I think we're going to go into Q&A mode now. And I think that my other colleagues, Rick and Zev and Holly, are going to come online for us answering any of your questions.
Oh, the real Holly, since there's a lot of Holly Huffnagles online.
Thank you all for those presentations, and I think our global audience would concur that they were filled with useful and practical information. We encourage your questions. Please continue to send them to questions@ajc.org. We have a few from our audience this evening. Let me begin with the first question to Zev Hurwitz. What is the impact of the Title VI executive order on anti-Semitism? Has it been useful? And what has been the reaction of campus administrators to this executive order?
For sure. So just to back up a little bit, the executive order, unless something else has happened in the last couple of minutes, the executive order that's being discussed here was passed or was announced in December 2019, and it was primarily focused on increasing protections for Jewish students on campus through the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of antisemitism, and a policy against anti-Semitism on campus that was
This is a guy who had a pillow back.
Designed primarily to make the experience of Jewish students on campus safer, right? There are some things that the executive order does, and there are some things that the executive order does not do. One thing that it does, which is very important, is that it demonstrated from the executive branch of the United States government that this is a priority concern. That even though we talked about how this isn't the case for the majority of Jewish students on campus, for the ones that are experiencing direct anti-Semitism, this is a problem. And so this was a great exercise in signaling that this is something that the administration is taking seriously. What it does not do is it doesn't change existing US law, and it doesn't change anything in terms of actually talking about discrimination in language of it being illegal or it being frowned upon, or federal funding being withheld for environments that are supportive of bigotry and hatred. That's not new, right? And so one of the big concerns that the anti-Israel community had, and I'm saying anti-Israel community here, but one of the concerns the anti-Israel community had is that the IRA definition of anti-Semitism talks a lot about a couple of different ways that that anti-Semitism can be manifested through anti-Israel activity. Now, notice the distinction in language here. Anti-Israel activity can be a form of anti-Semitism, whereas anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, right? So the concern here was from anti-Israel activists that whether or not they are admittedly adherents to the BDS movement, that their anti-Israel demonstrations on campus would be considered anti-Semitism and therefore banned on campus. So in short, this was seen by a lot of anti-Israel folks on campus as being an attempt to limit anti-Israel speech on campus. And so the biggest concern from our end has been the implementation of the executive order. AJC and hopefully most, if not all, Americans are supportive of the First Amendment and the right to free speech. We don't have to like what's being said on campus, but we do have to support the right for students to be demonstrating on a number of causes, even if we don't like the content. So the response from administrators has been a little bit mixed. There are some campuses that have endorsed the IRA definition, which would align them with the underlying goal of the executive order. And then there are some that have decided not to wade into this issue right now because there are concerns that this could be seen as a restriction on free speech. So it really remains to be seen what the long-term impact is, but the short-term impact, the positive is that there was signaling that this is an important issue that's being taken seriously, but it doesn't actually change very much in terms of what is actually, what policies are actually governing hate and responding to hate on campus.
Thank you, Zev. Our next question is directed to Holly, and looking at the online platforms, some of the bigger, more recognizable names, and looking at the scope of the issue, what would be the efficacy of AJC actually enlisting these large media companies in creating a public service platform, public service awareness campaign through these actual portals? And is that something that AJC would be open to considering?
Thank you, Rick. You know, it's a good idea. I actually think that we are moving in that direction to be engaging these tech companies. You know, we as a civil society organization can go places actually where even the US government cannot. And that's why it's so important with coalitions, et cetera. So yes, I think at least with Facebook, but with other social media companies, you're going to start to see increased AJC engagement, because we know that the best way to push back on anti-Semitism online, which is the most anti-Semitism in the world today, is online. So we have to engage with these tech platforms and companies. We have some here in Los Angeles. We also have many, and of course in Silicon Valley with our San Francisco office, connecting with them. But this will be what you're going to be seeing in the next few years. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Holly. A question now for Siamak. The political climate today and the fact that we are still in the midst of a national election cycle, albeit backburnered given the current crisis. What can AJC and what can AJC supporters and rank and file members of the community do to demand, or at least strongly encourage, those seeking elective office to commit themselves to conducting campaigns that bring civility back to public discourse?
A very good question. I think we could probably have an entire lecture series on civility in American public discourse. I think that you know, we're in a very difficult time in our country. I think that the polarization has gotten worse and worse in recent years, and I think that's also, as I mentioned in my segment, it's impacted the issues that we're working on. I think that you know, members of Congress are very sensitive to constituents calling their offices. They're perhaps even more sensitive to calls to the office than they are to sometimes writing, but they're sensitive to, they're definitely sensitive to both. I think, you know, you have to make your voice heard at that level, but you have to do it in a way that is, you know, they get a lot of noise every day. They get a lot of people contacting them. I think one of our senior board members wanted to communicate something to a local Congress member, and was having a hard time getting through to them, and actually decided to show up to a town hall in person and approach the Congress member after the event, and really got the message through. And I think that's 1 out of 435 members of Congress, but that is in terms of a drop in the bucket, it's at least a drop in the bucket and not a drop in the ocean. So it's a whole lot better than a drop in the ocean. I think those touch points, if and where you can do it, is really great. But you have to approach them in a way that's credible. You don't get their ear very often, and you need to communicate to them to hold themselves to a high standard. And if we want to talk about that in the context of issues relating to anti-Semitism in Israel, that's a separate and longer conversation to be had.
Thank you very much, Siamak. Holly, coming back to you again in terms of online hate. Is there anything that AJC is doing to help parents connect with their kids and form a bridge of understanding and a certain protocol for being online and for not inadvertently or unwittingly becoming victims of online hate?
That's another good question. So at AJC, we have resources on combating hate online, including this Translate Hate, which I mentioned, which again would be a great tool for parents to go through with kids on what is anti-Semitism and what they can do with that information when they see it online. I don't think we have a program actually for parents to teach their kids. Maybe Zev, if you know anything with Lyft, you can mention that. But to my knowledge, it's just there for parents to go to and then connect with their kids on their own. But again, it's an avenue that we might be looking toward in the next couple years.
Thank you. Next question for Zev. Is there coming back to the BDS discussion, is there a distinction or potentially a disconnect between what students are experiencing on a campus versus what some of the more entrenched faculty members may be fomenting or under the cover or guise of academic freedom and or their tenured position that can contribute to a corrosive climate on campus?
Sure. So we definitely see some similarities between the student experience and the faculty experience in terms of a couple of things. One being that there are pro-Israel and Jewish faculty members at colleges across the country. And then there are faculty members who are Jewish or not Jewish who make hatred of Israel or targeting or demonization of Israel their number one issue outside the subject that they teach, or even inside the subject that they teach. My first class, my first day of college, I walked into a classroom on race relations in the United States, and the first thing out of the professor's mouth was talking about the Palestinian bid for statehood and how that was such a wonderful snub to the state of Israel. And I had been in college for all of 6 minutes before somebody utilized their tenured position to start talking about all of the reasons Israel was no good. I think that this is yet to be the big issue on campus. Faculty advocacy tends to be more muted than, with exception, Pitzer College is the most obvious exception because that was an academic boycott movement that started from faculty and ended up spilling over into a student movement. But there is a concern that there are university professors that use their classroom setting to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with a lens that is maybe less than objective. And students have to decide, is it more important to, it's not an easy choice, but is it more important to stand up in class and push back and say, well, actually, that's not true? Or why are you, singling out Israel? Or why are you using our class on statistics or race relations in the United States to talk about Israel? that's one option. The other option is this person controls my grade. My GPA can go down if I push back in the middle of class. So that's a very real concern. I don't know that it's yet become the issue on campus. I think that students are still much more concerned with student initiatives. Right now, there's a referendum that's going online at Columbia University. A BDS resolution has moved to a student-wide vote online. That is still dominating the campus conversation. And then just really quickly to touch on something that Holly just mentioned, AJC has this very robust Leaders for Tomorrow program that operates currently in 12 cities across the US and soon to be 14 cities next year, including in Los Angeles. And so I definitely encourage anybody who has a high school student who is a sophomore, junior, or going to be a sophomore, junior, or senior next year to consider looking into the Leaders for Tomorrow program, because we talk a lot about not only the issues that are on campus, but the issues that are facing the Jewish community with regard to anti-Semitism, and also the opportunities with regard to coalition building and interfaith relationships. We cover all of that in a series of Sunday afternoon sessions throughout the year. So if anybody on the webinar is interested in learning more about that, there's information about LIFT on the website, or my email address is on the AJC website as well. So please look me up, ask me questions about LIFT.
And Zev, just to follow up there, how many AJC cities currently have LIFT programs? Because our audience this evening is really nationwide, and it would be a good opportunity to do a little bit of a commercial.
Sure. I don't know that I can list off all 12 cities, but it's currently in 12 cities. It's expanding to 2 more regions next year. And it's a growing program. AJC has 22 regional offices, so more than half of our regional offices now have a high school leadership corps that becomes the college student of tomorrow or the year after. And these are relationships that we're maintaining with students throughout their time in college, because they are exhibiting signs of leadership in high school, and once they have the tools to be effective leaders in college, we're going to stick with them.
Thank you. And as we begin to wind down the hour or so, I want to pose a question to each of you, and not to put you too much on the spot, but if there is one specific action step that you would encourage our audience, this constituency, to take away from each of your focus areas this evening, one concrete, tangible step, what would that be? We'll start with Siamak.
I would say get a list of your friends, family members, business associates and connections that don't live in your immediate area, and send them the action alerts on the bipartisan anti-Semitism task force and the No Hate Act, to ask their representative to sign on. And even if they do not sign on, it will still serve the purpose that if and when initiatives come to the House floor, either in the form of a bill or a letter or something like that, then even if that member of Congress is not a co-sponsor of a bill, they will be less likely to vote against it or oppose it for any reason, including budget or financial or other reasons, if they know that they've been contacted by someone who supports the issue.
Thank you. Holly, please.
So I'll start your question with a little bit of a statistic. We're seeing increases of reports of anti-Semitism, but still it's quite small when we know the actual Jewish communities who are receiving anti-Semitic hatred and vitriol. I'm not talking about online, offline as well. And this is really for 2 reasons, not just in the United States, but also in Europe. It's something called the normalization of anti-Semitism, right? So it's just becoming normalized. So they made a remark at me, but it wasn't that bad. And so I'm just gonna brush it off. And so that's the normalization of anti-Semitism. There's also the resignation in the fight against anti-Semitism, that if I say something, nothing will be done. They won't do it, the police won't go after the perpetrator, nothing will happen. So people aren't really, reporting this is mostly offline, right? The resignation in the fight against anti-Semitism, the normalization of anti-Semitism. I would argue that those things are actually happening online as well. We as internet users, as netizens, if you will, we're citizens of the internet. We're saying nothing can be done. We're powerless here. It's just so big, we can't do anything about it. But actually, studies have shown that when individuals become in large numbers work together to do the reporting, to become trusted flaggers, to take online classes on how to be a flagger, so like tech companies actually will trust you, it can be done, and we can push back. So it's going to be a collective effort, but we need to believe that we can do it.
Thank you very much. And Zev, please.
I'm going to preface with, please don't do this in person right now. Please practice social distancing, but talk to the college student in your life. Whether that's a child, a friend, a grandchild, a neighbor, somebody in your life is in college right now. Or you probably know a Jewish student who's in college or who was in college recently, and have a conversation with them. What is your Jewish experience like on campus? Are your religious needs being met? Are you experiencing anti-Semitism? What's Israel life like on campus? Is this even a concern for you? Hear directly from students what their experience is. Don't let scary news stories define your understanding of what the campus space is like. Really go straight to the source and have those conversations there. But my absolute favorite thing that I do in my job at AJC is when I'm talking face-to-face with a student and hearing exactly about what's going on campus. I'm not hearing it third hand. I'm not reading about it in an article. I'm hearing exactly how a student is perceiving their experience. And that's so important because there's this tendency to read something scary, to say, oh, I've got to do something. I got to drive over to UCLA right now. I've got to get on campus and I need to take action to support Jewish students. It's very easy to have that mentality, except at the end of the day, you get to go home, and the college students that are dealing with issues on campus have to stay, and they're going to be there the day after and the day after that. And if you don't have any college students in your life that you feel comfortable talking to, reach out to Hillel. Hillel is always happy to have conversations about what their work looks like, and most of their work across the country, and I speak to Hillel directors basically every single week here. Hillels aren't creating positive experiences for Jewish students on campus, and Jewish students are having positive experiences. And you're not going to hear that if you only look for news articles about students. You're going to only hear that from having one-to-one conversations. Right now, have those conversations on the phone or via Zoom or Skype. Do not have those conversations in person.
Thank you, Zev. And as we wrap up our program, I simply want to express my gratitude to the three of you. You make us proud. You make the AJC family proud each and every day with your passion, your commitment, your integrity, and tremendous, tremendous smarts. That's AJC at its finest. I want to thank you all again, and especially thank our friends and extended family at Wilshire Boulevard Temple. We appreciate all of you joining with us tonight, as well as our partners at Jewish Insider. In addition, as you may have heard and hopefully are participating already, AJC is encouraging and highlighting acts of kindness during this current crisis as part of our newly launched #BeAMensch campaign. Visit ajc.org/BeAMensch, that's BeAMensch, to submit your own story of Menschy behavior, or share it on social media using the #BeAMensch. At this time of great anxiety and challenge for our world, we hope you will stay safe and be healthy. Good night, and thank you.